Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you for having me. My name is Ioana Bujor, and I do research at the University of Bucharest, where I also teach Hebrew, mostly Hebrew, biblical and modern Hebrew. So the topic that I'm going to share with you today is closely related to my area of expertise. The paper is titled, as you can see, for those who want to speak Hebrew and not just chant, it's Spinoza's Compendium of the Hebrew Language. And it was also part of my PhD thesis. It deals with a work that is not so well known of Spinoza, Hebrew grammar, that has received very limited attention compared to other works of Spinoza. The quote that you see in the quotation marks is part of this compendium, and I'm gonna address it a bit later. Before diving into today's topic, let me just briefly introduce Baruch Spinoza for those of you who are not so familiar with his work. He is well known as being a philosopher, a 17th century philosopher, following the philosophical thought of René Descartes. His most famous work is the Ethics, which is a pure philosophical work, which somehow changed the European philosophical thought. But also he's well known for his theological political treatise, where he is a very fervent critic of Jewish tradition and scripture. You can also see on the slide that he was born in Amsterdam, and he was of Jewish origin, being part of the Jewish Amsterdam community, which was the one that actually excommunicated him. This is the most intriguing and mysterious event, part of his biography, the excommunication of Spinoza in 1656. He is accused of abominable heresies and monstrous deeds. These are very big words, but actually we don't know exactly what that means because in the text of the excommunication, there is not said specifically what Spinoza has done. But other than this, this decision of excommunication is said to be one of the severe and harsh decisions of excommunication from the 17th century. It's worth noting that during his time, he published only one work, and it was published anonymously. And you can see that it's published after the moment of excommunication. And this is the Theological Political Treatise. And I've also provided here a brief overview of his works, all published after his death in opera postuma in Latin. So you may wonder at this point, what is Spinoza doing on a conference on language, education, considering the fact that he is primarily a philosopher. What I aim to show you today is that Spinoza was also a philologist, or maybe a grammarian, specifically because of this work, Compendium Grammatices Linguæ Hebrææ, or the Compendium on the grammar of the Hebrew language. You can see here the first pages of this book, written in Latin, as I was saying. It was also translated in some modern languages. We have one English translation from the 60s, also a very good translation in French, and one in Latin. I have translated this book in Romanian as part of my PhD thesis. And I'm also aware that there is also a Czech version of it that I have not consulted, but I think that would be really interesting to do it. The conditions in which Spinoza's compendium was published in opera postuma are rather strange, as Stephen Nadler, which is a researcher that deals with Spinoza's philosophical thought, says. He points out that the compendium also did not make it into the opera postuma, and I think he somehow beautifully says that it was an afterthought, which can lead us to the question, why did Spinoza write a Hebrew grammar, and of course, for whom? To better understand the issues surrounding this strange book, I provided on the slide a diagram illustrating how it was received over time. And there are several, let's just say, trends among researchers. The most dismissive one is that the compendium does not hold any interest. Spinoza was a philosopher. He wrote beautifully the philosophy. We are not interested in his grammatical endeavors. Some place the compendium in relation to the medieval grammars that preceded Spinoza. Others, and this is the most popular approach, see the compendium as an object of philosophical inquiry. It was also be studied from a linguistic perspective, leaving the philosophy of Spinoza aside. And of course, there are some mixture views from philosophy and linguistics. And finally, the compendium is also linked to Spinoza's theological political treatise, which is a view that I also support. And I think that it creates an interesting dialogue within the corpus of Spinoza as well. Now, it is believed that he worked on the compendium towards the end of his life in 1677, which is why the work is incomplete. It was intended to have two parts. The first part that we have today is the only remaining part. It has 33 chapters, and it deals with morphology. The second part was supposed to deal with syntax, but we have no trace of that. Only some brief references in the first part of the compendium, where Spinoza somehow announces the reader that some of the things will be discussed in the second part of the compendium, dealing with the syntax, which unfortunately never happened. The work is written in Latin, following the common format of grammar books from that period. And what is remarkable is that this is the first book of its kind written by an author of Jewish origin. Because in the 17th century, we have many Hebrew grammar books. What Spinoza does is not something new, deciding to write a Hebrew grammar. But there were, let's say, two schools of thought. The Jewish authors that wrote Hebrew grammars in Hebrew and following the grammatical tradition of Semitic languages, mostly Arabic. And on the other side, there were the Latin Hebrews, Christian Hebrews that were written in Latin, following the Latin pattern. What Spinoza does here is somehow a mixture of this, because he tries to force the Hebrew model into a Latin one, and it gets to a strange thing. To give you a sense what the compendium looks like, here are some pages, like random pages from the book. For example, here is the second chapter of the grammar, where Spinoza introduces the Hebrew alphabet. And you can see on the first row the Hebrew letters in the Hebrew script, then their transliteration in Latin script, the name of the letter, because in Hebrew each letter has a name, and some additional details when needed. Here, for example, we have something related to the verb. There are different verbal forms, participle verbal forms. At one point, Spinoza's grammar tends to be a bit dull, because it's full of tables of verb conjugation with no much involvement from this part. And here we have an example of a noun that Spinoza takes and declinates, which is something pretty peculiar for Hebrew, because we have here the noun cases. In Hebrew, we have to respect the traditional grammatical model. There are no cases. I mean, there were some archaic ones, but usually when you open a normal Hebrew grammar, you don't see cases because you don't have them. What Spinoza does here is to use some prepositions to express this noun case. Now, there is much to be said, of course, about this grammar, but I will attempt to emphasize what is particularly interesting about it. Specifically, I believe we can speak about a mechanism, a sort of mechanism in the compendium that rests on two major pillars. Spinoza's main point, and actually his criticism, can be very well summarized by this phrase. There are many who have written a grammar of scriptures, but none who have written a grammar of the Hebrew language. It is important to remember that at the time when Spinoza was writing, Hebrew was not an actively spoken language. It was a language used for liturgical purposes in the synagogue, for example, or for administrative purposes, but it wasn't spoken. The grammars that were written before this grammar had a very strong scriptural component. Somehow the traditional way of thinking was that Hebrew is a holy language. Hebrew is the language of the scripture, is the language of God, the language where the word was created. And the grammars were constructed on the basis of the scripture text, because that was the only available sample that that they had and that we still have. What Spinoza does is that he says, no, let's forget about that discourse and treat Hebrew as a very normal, usual language, and let's analyze it rigorously. And this is also the title of where the title of my presentation comes into play. So for those who want to speak Hebrew, we can see that Spinoza points towards or aims towards an actively speaking of language, and not just chanted, tending to this liturgical purpose of Hebrew until then. He does this by two things. He introduces an active component to the language, which is this usus, how the language was used, how people from the biblical times used to speak. He does this through appeal to experience, usage, and the social historical context. For example, he also speaks about dialects, which was pretty new until then. And an additional component is analogia, which is actually the reconstruction of the language through some deductions. Spinoza has an advantage, and he can use this because Hebrew is a very mathematical language. It has a very axiomatic deductive structure, and you can mechanically construct or reconstruct forms based on some pattern. And Spinoza knows this. He probably knew Hebrew very well, even though he wasn't actively speaking it. But his argument is that not all knowledge we possess can be found in the scripture alone. We can extend it by constructing forms that are not present in the scripture. He emphasizes that the only memory we have of the Hebrew language is the memory of a text, which, as he frequently criticizes, could have been corrupted by errors of some scribe or copyist that kept copying the text. We can say that Spinoza aims to go beyond the text of the Hebrew Bible, and the memory he seeks through this usus is not merely of the biblical text, but somehow an intrinsic memory of the Hebrew language. And the biblical text is only a sample to help readers to see how Hebrew was used. Instead, let's just say, of a conclusion, I try to point out actually something related to my future research and what I'm focusing now, trying to find an answer to this question: for whom is Spinoza writing this grammar? A possible response to this question can be found in the note that precedes the compendium. This is a translation in English by Maurice Bloom, the only translation that exists in English. And here we can see this, this observation that Spinoza wrote this at the request of some friends. The Latin text said actually that these friends were not necessarily diligently studying, but they were very preoccupied with studying the Hebrew language. The question is, who are these friends? Of course, we don't know for sure. There is some speculation that it's possible that the group of friends who edited the Opera Postuma could be the same friends that wanted to learn Hebrew language. So now part of my research is that I'm trying to find, to reconstruct the group of friends around Spinoza. Yeah, basically. Thank you very much.